Привет, hello, bonjour baguette. You've come through the first part already. If you missed it, don't hesitate going back in time before listening to that one. Nice listening to you, fellow humans. Viral scams. Part 2. History is being written on a daily basis. Instead of making history, we are made by history. Martin Luther King. It is October 18th, 2019 in the city of Nouvelle-Angoulême, which you may be more familiar with the modern denomination, New York. Later, we will also travel in this city, said to never sleep, at different times in history. For the moment, in this dark room, sober and luxurious in its furnishings, especially its chairs, which give the impression of floating on a cloud, a high-profile exercise is about to take place. At Eastern Standard Time, it's approaching noon. It's Friday. The sponsors of the event, the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, the Hopkins Center for Health and Security, and the World Economic Forum are about to unveil to the world, and initially to the 15 organizations present, their new, ink-spilling, drool-inducing scenario. Event 201 was, 2 months before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, a global pandemic simulation. I will explore its nooks and crannies briefly, as I cannot focus all my effort on this one act. I will complete this puzzle in a methodical way, keeping my focus on the path I'm taking. I am not putting any pressure on myself or setting a deadline, but I am determined to complete this piece of writing that I started on April 26, 2023. I can't tell you when it will be completed, and after all, that is of little importance, as the story is being written every day. I will not be the first or the last to talk about history. We remember Thucydide, Herodotus, Marco Polo and others. Fewer recent names, fewer women. Let us ask ourselves, what are the values we want to reincarnate as a society, a community, a family or an individual? Let us feel the strength to thwart the plan of an elite making history today. What will tomorrow's historians say? If they are concerned about their image, the elite, should they not show a good attitude towards the population that is ready to take out its pencil and note the slightest salient facts? I will mostly focus on facts that have been verified to date. I will sometimes take the time to comment on them and put forward hypotheses. However, don't forget that just because the majority says something, it doesn't mean that it is necessarily right. The minority can also prevail, and it is time for a wind of renewal into our societies, to perhaps put in cages those who have annihilated us for a time by their passage, filled with ransacking and pillaging. It is they who have fueled our rage, who will have made us see that in this age we can no longer afford such childishness. It is time for revolutions. Once again, history will not shine by its beauty, nor is that its mission. Don't ever think that I could bring you all the elements. History is not made alone, but by many. If what I'm saying appeals to you, put a bug in your ear, go ahead and run in search of information, soliciting your most energetic and evolved organ, producer of electricity. Compare my words with others, taking care to check what his or her words are supported by, what their ideological biases are, mine included. I have made it my personal mission to try to understand this puzzle, to complete it, no matter how long it takes me. I am delivering it to you in small pieces, those that I am able to assemble day after day, and that I have already accumulated in the past. Sometimes I will leave, but don't see this as an abandonment on my part. It's always to come back stronger. I received 2 doses of COVID-19 vaccine. Skeptical. The first one I received was on December 21st, 2021, from the manufacturer Pfizer. The second one, before starting a trip to the old continent as they say, will have been with Moderna in October 2022, not being able to be administered the Pfizer in second dose because too much risk of clamps in the 18 to 24 years old range, myocarditis and pericarditis. It is not a question of being proud of it, of having one of these vaccines or not. It is not a star to be brandished or not, like the Star of David, which was used to recognize a minority to better squander it. Some people pointed this out quite early on, when people who did not want to be vaccinated started to be put aside for a reason that is their own and that no one can judge. We have the right to consider that it is more or less valid, depending on the arguments put forward, but never to put a person aside for something as futile as a vaccine shot. It would have protected the most physically vulnerable people, I thought, which is right and which I would still defend if I had to do it again. Anyway, I'm not one to cultivate regret, but why lock up the population as a whole at all costs, when the majority was never really at risk of serious after effects? Better prevent than cure, as the saying goes. By way of precaution, as I personally understand it, it was better not to throw oneself into the lion's den right away. This invisible enemy who, whatever one may say, did exist. This is what I am partly questioning today, its origin, which has already been the subject of documentaries and books. I am now adding my voice to those, because people are asking for answers that are not given to them by the establishment that constantly tries to divert our attention. My stated aim is to support the minorities who together form a majority against the 0.1%. I am obliged to mention certain events, as you will have seen and will see, but I do not have to say everything, as this would be impossible for me as a single individual. You will have understood that this is my case, being at present the only brain behind it, benefiting from that of others, who may have been working before me for millennia. As Isaac Newton said, if I have seen so far, it is because I have been sitting on the shoulders of giants. I agree with him. Coming back to COVID-19, it seems true that there is a long COVID, which can have an impact on the nervous system. Unless this is just the result of well-orchestrated propaganda, manipulating us with fear and stress, which are vector of cancers and also act on the nervous system. To tell the truth, I don't know. It's still too early to say. I'm just wondering. However, in order to argue that COVID-19 can produce such effects and have results that can be called scientific, verified and peer-reviewed, the subjects of the experiment must be kept in a controlled environment. This means that in order to pinpoint one particular cause and not another, the individual must not be exposed to external stimuli such as air pollution, work, having a mobile phone in their hands or any other distraction of your choice. This list is not meant to be exhaustive. Nevertheless, when we see a sudden acceleration of one or more particular symptoms that are concomitant with the onset of another phenomenon, we can hypothesize that the two elements are linked. except that this will remain an assumption until it's verified over and over again. You have to take the time to know what you are dealing with. In the case of coronaviruses, there are over 100 of them and we already knew about them. So, producing a vaccine was quite easy for scientists who could build on the first SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2003, the MERS coronavirus outbreak and others. One of the great dangers that will hit us, and I'm talking primarily about polar regions containing permafrost, is the return to life of zombie viruses about which we know almost nothing, having only just begun to study them. There have already been outbreaks of those viruses on the surface. For this reason, among others, new P4 laboratories, the highest level of security, are going to be opened around the world, which is more than questionable, after we need security. Underground labs with a clear protocol in case of a virus leak could be a possibility, but I'm just speculating. Coming back to the virus that hit us and that was easy to fight against, especially if we had been better prepared by listening to the scientists. Again, there was a lot to suggest that something was wrong. When so-called scientists or experts take 2 years to raise the possibility that perhaps, without prejudice, the deteriorating air quality, which takes away 7 million souls each year, could, and I mean could, have an impact on a mainly respiratory disease, it is ridiculous. But don't worry, it is nothing compared to the rest. One of the elements I cultivate is the fact of trying never to be surprised by an event, because it is by surprise that they can get us, as with the pandemic, which was real, I repeat, but which may have benefited an already comfortable elite that is undeniable. In my lifetime, and I know many share this, COVID-19 was my only pandemic experience of this magnitude. Worldwide, cutting us off from our fellow human beings, from our walks outside, from our pleasures. To be honest, it had little impact on me. I've always been used to staying indoors, enjoying simple pleasures like reading a book or watching a documentary, listening to music and daydreaming. I never had this need to go to bars or restaurants. Besides, it wasn't as if I had a big family or many friends at that time. Nature was just around the corner, on the land I was occupying during that time. When the first lockdown happened, having roommates, it was still more pleasant than the complete solitude that millions of people around the world have no doubt experienced. I had been much more affected by the plight of an indigenous nation, the Wet'suwet'en, in Canada, particularly in the West, although there were outpourings of solidarity across the country. At that time, in January and February of 2020, when we were beginning to hear about the virus from China, there was nothing but negativity on the traditional airwaves about the struggles of this nation, who categorically refused, by blocking railways with other people from civil society, the arrival of a new pipeline that was finally bought by the Trudeau government. Subsequently, the pandemic was an opportunity, in Canada, Brazil or elsewhere, to override certain laws that went against nature, which, by temporarily taking us off the roads, except for delivery trucks, was finally able to have a momentary rest, allowing the inhabitants of New Delhi, for example, to see the sky, which they had not seen for ages. It was then, as advocated in the text of the Great Reset, an incredible turn towards the digital or Fourth Industrial Revolution, despite the warnings about the possible totalitarian drift that this could engender and which are described in the Great Reset, We are already close to totalitarian ideology, and I will defend this idea in part all along this paper. The text, written by Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum since 1971, and Thierry Maleret, was aimed at not allowing a return to the normalcy that had never been won. In the 400 pages that make up the book, there seems to be a willingness to reform the institution that brings together the crème de la crème in Davos, Switzerland. However, I have an initial doubt emerging. Earlier, in 2001 and 2008, the forum had openly displayed its desire for reform, understanding, a priori, the demand of the alter-globalists, and say it was open to listening to them. And then, after the subprime crisis in 2007, spoke of applying regulations to the banks, all after having advocated unbridled capitalism, a mortifying neoliberalism that had first taken roots in South America, more precisely in Chile and Argentina, under the aegis of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. Schwab is therefore, at first sight, not credible when he speaks of a desire to change for the better or to listen to the population. Other arguments will be made not far away, here and there, in the near future, in order to defeat this project of society that is shelled by our rulers, McKinsey, and the great world powers that were built on the slave trade, persevering in their outrage of another age. It is necessary to go further than the image that is given off by a person. His or her is not enough to understand him and his or her entirety. It is necessary to investigate the past, the present relationships, and the vision of the future of this person. Now, let's go back to the Great Reset. The text argues that we should think more about nature and the human species, questioning neoliberalism. Capitalism, for its part, is not rejected, with Schwab asking for what kind of capitalism we want now. I won't go into details about the Great Reset, which I have already mentioned on my channel, as many other people did. What is noteworthy there, when I add this new piece to the puzzle, is that the Davos Forum is both the organizer of a potentially suspicious-looking event in New York 2 months before the pandemic, and the editor of a book intended to set in motion a supposedly green shift, advising on what to do in this era. I will have time to come back to that. Now, if you don't mind, I'll go back a bit to talk about Event 201. I told you earlier that it took place on October 18, 2019 on a Friday at noon with influential organizations from the private and public world. This was an opportunity to simulate a global pandemic of coronavirus from Brazil, transmitted to humans by pigs. The global impacts are then explored in this meeting, which was filmed and can easily be found. There are excerpts from the news reassuring the population how to develop effective vaccines and how to deploy them on a large scale, etc. So, does this mean that the Schwab Forum, with its sprawling grip, is behind the pandemic? We must proceed with caution and never jump to conclusion too fast. Remember what I said earlier. There are more than 100 coronaviruses, and this is the third one to hit us in 20 years. In itself, it is therefore quite logical to simulate a worldwide coronavirus pandemic. This doesn't incriminate the actor of the event in any way. A few months later, at the beginning of 2020, I come back to this. Because of its link with the governments of the world, the forum was already very well placed to write a text like the Great Reset, knowing that it was listened to And it's true that Schwab is taken into consideration, the leaders being in debt to him for the notoriety he offers them. What can we say about the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, which was also an organizer? It is now known that it was not honest about the Ebola virus. In 2015, Bill Gates, during a TED Talk, announced that the pandemic risk would become greater and warned the population of their arrival. Was he right? Yes, and there is nothing prophetic about it. In fact, he was simply relaying the words of virologists and biologists who have been worrying and warning our government worked for nearly 2 decades. Have they done so? Absolutely not. So why, on this day, are they congratulating themselves for having managed this pandemic well? The only valid answer I can come up with to this last question is that they are simply playing with us, manipulating us and turning us against each other. This game must stop. If they are playing with us, it does not mean that they are at the source of the virus itself. However, when you read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, you realize that, whether by chance or premeditated, the conditions were met to impose a shock doctrine. It is a question of a government using a crisis and turn it at its advantage, whatever its origin, to impose measures that in normal circumstances would not be allowed to pass. We have seen this in Canada, in Quebec and elsewhere in the world, and I will come back to this. However, if we rely on public opinion, we must believe that good work has been done by these leaders who have been re-elected. Trudeau, Legault, Macron, etc. The propaganda machine continues and is now proven efficient. Russian hypernormalization is taking shape in the West, no longer able, individually, to sort out the real from the fake, and the mainstream media is only making it worse. Even 201, which to my knowledge was never mentioned by the main news channels, quickly circulated on alternative networks, which at least have the merit of naming the disruptive elements. Nevertheless, the conclusions are, in my opinion, often misleading for many of them. A person claiming to understand everything and operating on a principle of argumentative millefeuille or cherry-picking, picking the most interesting fruits, voluntarily or not, can seduce for a while, but cannot fit into this physical dimension for long, unless we live in a sick society, another possibility. Yet, at first sight, many people have fallen for it, which is not a bad thing. Once again, everyone can make a mistake. I've experienced that. Just look at our neighbors to the south, in the US, where Donald Trump, inspired by his Russian counterpart, was elected by circumventing the electoral system thanks to Cambridge Analytica and collected more than 70 million votes in 2020. All this, while his rise to power was based on a pack of lies that he continued to spew throughout his term and beyond. He has never been there to allegedly clean the swamp. In itself, Trump was not a reformer. He is the antithesis of one. He has made some good moves, but over the whole of his term in office, one cannot really say that this is very good. I have nothing against those who like this man, about whom I will come back to this story in part. I am not here to judge. You must have good reason for liking him, and we could talk about that again because I think that I can understand even a small part of why. When you look at the whole puzzle, it all starts to take shape, slowly but surely. Let's put the pieces of this puzzle in order. For nearly 2 decades, if we pay attention, We can hear the alarmism from scientists who tell us that pandemics are going to become more and more recurrent, having given the facts to our government who have remained limp. Let that be the case. We are all entitled to make mistakes. We are human. I am not saying that we should punish these miscreants who are in no way accountable at the moment. Let's just sully their seemingly precious image if it's worth doing. I will not be the judge. These miscreants, in search of power and glory, they are only here for a very short time. They generally come straight out of schools that have trained them to become good leaders. That is to say, to think above all of their own and their social class interests, which is obliged, against all odds, by class consciousness, to fight against the proletariat, which it must keep under its way, being aware that revolutions can happen. The fact that they are here for 4 or 5 years, then renewing their mandate according to what is allowed within the entity in which you evolve, does not impute them, these lupa who run after money. The laws are badly made, precisely because they and their predecessor wrote them, and not the people who see their rights being taken away. To go back to the near past, it can be said that the rulers were taken by surprise by the arrival of this new virus, which China tried to hide for as long as it could by telling the WHO that there was no sign of human-to-human transmission. However, Taiwan tried to warn the UN's daughter organization on December 31, 2019, by sending an email requesting an investigation, which was refused by the WHO. About 2 months later, word of a fake pandemic began to spread. The information about Event 201 was found by networks that circulated it on the web, against a backdrop of misunderstanding of the science that has suffered much damage in recent decades. Paradoxically continuing to progress at the same time, there were questions rising. One day a mask had to be put on, the next day not, and the day after that, it had to be put back on. It is also important to understand that it was a first for the authorities to listen to science, as they had no other choice to recover their beloved economy. Depending on what the government and the consultancy firm said, adjustments were made and they were not always successful. Finally, we learned quite recently that in Quebec and certainly elsewhere, it was McKinsey that decided, or rather proposed, to do business with the worst of the bad guys in the business, Pfizer. I could not name all the charges and fine that the company received. That would require a book in itself. I am trying to play devil's advocate here. Let's say that our leaders were ignorant, which at first sight sounds obvious, being all ignorant without it being unhealthy. They would have been ignorant of the fact that pandemics could happen, and even if they weren't, that they knew about it. They just had to hope that it wouldn't happen during their term of office, but during the next one. It is not in the capitalist or neoliberal logic to start something that does not help speculation, that does not bring in anything but shed costs, like pandemic material. If they have not been taught to plan and look ahead for future generations, then they simply do not deserve to be there. Yet, as I said, they were re-elected, which in a way demonstrates or supports the fact that the population as a majority believe in all of this, that they have done a good job. Yet, they started, through different channels, to send a negative message to belittle a part of the population that seemed to be much closer to some form of truth than they were. We started to let down people like us, who were just asking questions, sometimes jumping to conclusions a little too quickly, but people nonetheless. While they were no longer allowed to do anything because of unjustified and segregated measures, the others, having done their part, had the right to life again, could travel and carry the virus all over the planet, bringing variants here, and then pointing the finger at non-vaccinated who had not left their homes since the beginning of the year 2020, except to go and get a few supplies and go around the places where it was decided for them if they were essential or not. Yes, the vaccinated will have experienced this too, waiting for the vaccines to arrive, which didn't happen in the blink of an eye either. So we will have experienced, apart from the most highly placed as usual, a moment of confinement, a moment to reflect, to reorient one's life, or whatever. There are positive things, as always, to be taken from this experience. On the other hand, it was also rich in lessons for the elite who succeeded in making us swallow such nonsense. They brought out their violins, invoking science, technique that have been tried and tested for several decades in the field of medicine, but also propaganda to make the population accept it all, including myself, having been vaccinated, as you know. Let's stop satisfying them by dividing us so that they can rule us better. In any case, it seems to me that there are many things that are not right at that time, and I know that I'm not the only one to think that. The truth, or the closest things to it, will come out at some point. This is part of what drives me to write, wanting also to dwell on other subjects, which I will let you discover later. Between the time I left for Europe on October 21st, 2022 and my return, exactly 2 months later, I was never once asked for proof of vaccination, which I was happy about, even though I had my proof in hand, in paper form. Important. I've had 2 doses and I could travel, as well as if I had none, but not wanting to take any chances, as I was about to cross some borders, not always being in the Schengen area. Being alone most of the time on this trip, I was able to meet more people than if I hadn't. Vaccinated, not vaccinated, what difference does it make? We are all human after all, but more and more we have this sectarian bias instilled in us, not naturally belonging to us, but the result of more than a century of propaganda with increasingly sophisticated tools. If we follow the predications, the internet will merge with the biological world and will soon no longer exist in the idle world of a certain elite, such as Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, which had advised Obama for his campaign in 2008, Elon Musk, or even Klaus Schwab, among a host of transhumanists. Digital technology, unlike other technologies, is evolving exponentially, doubling in size every 18 months. Some visionaries have imagined computers, holograms and other technologies that are more or less similar to what we use nowadays. Personally, I have often wondered if these men or women were really visionaries, or is it because we have read, seen or heard something that it inspires us to do the same thing later on? I guess it's a bit of both. The elite today makes many mistakes, but have almost always managed to keep the ball in their court. Thanks to powerful means, everything is done to keep them in their castle on quicksand for a few more years. They are dwarves in behemoth disguise. They hope to remain in control of the machine in order to preserve their false privileges as wealthy people. The truth is that they are unable to respond to this unprecedented crisis in human and Gaian history, being bound hand and foot to an inherently destructive ideology. during the history of our species, which is in fact, as we know to this day, combined in tiny parts with other human species, Neanderthal and Denisova, except for the people of Africa, the latter being the cradle of humanity. We have on the whole spent most of our time among nature, in connection with our human nature. We were among this all, without trying to idealize that time when the representatives of our species, whose genes we still carry, only live for 30 or 40 years when they, by chance, passed childhood. Homo sapiens, from whom we detain the majority of our genome, and who was believed to have eradicated other hominids when he arrived on the rest of the globe, was in fact wrong. He had rather mixed. About a month ago, I found myself watching a video on evolution. If we have the genes to fight alcohol today, except for Asians who have lower resistance, it would be because 4 million years ago, the monkey would have come down from its branch to go and collect fermented fruits containing ethanol. This is still only a hypothesis, as the facts are hard to verify in anthropology, even though this is tending to improve with genomic studies. More than 3 million years after that, 300,000 years ago, a new species of hominid appeared on the planet. Here is the grand entrance of Homo sapiens. It took him more than 200,000 years to leave Africa, more or less 70,000 years ago, during the first cognitive revolution. Homo sapiens then headed for the rest of the world where his fellow humans, Homo neanderthalensis and Denisova, among others, were already living. One group is said to have reached the oceanic continent around 45,000 years ago. Another, passing through the Bering Strait, reached the American coast more than 25,000 years ago. A natural climate change, of which there have been many over the past 4.5 billion years, occurred between 14 and 12,000 years ago, until the end of the last ice age. It was at this time that our species began to cultivate and, little by little, to raise livestock. This was the agricultural revolution, bringing new myths into play. Centuries then passed before the next revolution, scientific, then industrial, and finally digital, the last three having all taken place in the space of a second. If we take the time to look at the cosmic calendar, why then do we think we are so superior as the system would have us believe? I think that humility will be one of the keys to achieving our goals, like the one of building a just and thriving world. History, like science, can lead to this virtue of the soul. When we look at culture, we realize that it is essential to human life. It is what brings us together through language and common beliefs that we accept as truth. Yet, nothing is ever set in stone. Everything is subject to change. We don't know what fly will bite us tomorrow. The elite, however, continue to try to make us believe that everything they present to us as technocratic solutions is inevitable, to demoralize us, to prevent us from reaching our full potential. Occasionally, you might ask yourself, when you encounter an object, whether it is natural or not. In itself, everything is natural because it has passed through your mind and possibility through the mind of others in a subjective way for each of you, and that everything we use that is initially free, priceless, comes from Gaia before being processed by the human hand. The main question is whether other animals could imitate us. If not, then it is a psychic construction that we have been able to materialize in the physical world, like money, borders, and so on. In this case, if no other animal can copy us, it is because we can change this element for better or for worse. Generally, we want to vote for the best. Our main asset is our imagination. I've said it before, and I will say it again if necessary. As a species, if we want to deal with the problems we have to deal with, we are going to have to question our cultures. What is natural, meaning doable for other species, or not. If it's not, so much the better, because it has been imposed on you, and now you can touch freedom. Don't get me wrong, I am not selling you a famous, "You'll own nothing but be happy," like Schwab. Almost all animals have a home and we will be no exception. We are guaranteed access to nature. We will not let them deny it to us in the name of private property. Living simply is what we need in our collective history nowadays. To advocate alternatives to the neo-Greens, experts in greenwashing, who call us eco-fascists and think they can take over the whole political scene. The unicorns are not us but them, who still think that growth or the economy will save them. To live simply is not to decrease but to grow. To grow in terms of the energies we release. To grow in our quest for meaning, our spiritual quest for love and friendship. The world is beautiful. Let's save it.